You're listening to the Inbound Logistics Podcast with today's guest, Gregory Tuthill, Senior Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer for Seacube Container Leasing. From food to pharmaceuticals and beyond, some products rely on temperature-controlled shipping to reach markets on time and intact. However, that task is more than just making sure the truck stays cold. The dynamics, trends, and challenges of the cold supply chain ensure that the market has to continually evolve and adapt to keep delivering fleet efficiency and improved asset performance. Gregory Tuthill, Senior Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer for Seacube Container Leasing, gives us some cool advice on how to get the most out of the cold chain. Joining us today on the Inbound Logistics Podcast, we have Gregory Tuthill, Senior Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer for Seacube. Greg, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure.
It's great to have you. We're looking forward to our discussion about cold chain logistics, but before we do that, if I could get you to introduce yourself to our audience, give us a little bit about your background in the industry, what you've done, and what you're doing with Seacube today.
Sure. As you mentioned, my name is Greg Tuthill, and I am the Chief Commercial Officer for Seacube Container Leasing. We are one of the largest refrigerated container leasing companies and also lease dry containers, gensets, and other specialty asset classes. We have about 1.4 million T's of equipment in our fleet as of today, valued at over $4 billion. So in scale, we're pretty significant. But again, our specialty is in the cold chain sector. We like to think of ourselves as the leader in refrigerated container leasing, and also the most thoughtful technical leaders in the space as well. So we are happy to be on the show today, Jeff, and thank you for having me again.
Excellent. Great to have you. Let's talk about that market then, cold chain logistics. Given the recent disruptions and some of the economic headwinds that we're facing, what is your projection for the cold chain logistics market? Is it growing? Is it slowing down? Or where are we right now?
It's definitely going to continue to expand, and it could expand exponentially for a couple of reasons. One, and it's certainly in the headlines of most news publications today, and that is the climate change is creating an enormous disruption in not only the supply chain, but also in food outsourcing. So when you look at climate change, whether it's flooding, droughts, natural disasters that are created by climate change, these events are creating a lot of disruption in food outsourcing and also just the food supply in general. So that will continue to create more alternatives for outsourcing in refrigerated containers, and the food transport business will continue to expand probably beyond just the consumption rates. A couple other factors that I think are important. One is population growth. Population growth certainly is putting some urban pressure on certain sourcing regions. I think one great example of that is the seafood industry. So if you really think about what's happened in the seafood industry itself, most fish and seafood products are farmed today. 95% of our products that are imported are typically refrigerated and in containers in terms of the transport mode. So that's pretty significant in terms of how that expansion has taken place in that particular area as well. The other maybe other area just to mention before I close out on this particular question is disruption has been one certainly more pervasive in the last few years. It started, of course, in terms of the awareness of disruption with COVID, but it's continued. It's continued with natural events that have certainly impacted the supply chain, and that also has a big implication and create some impediments with imported food supply products.
All right, excellent. I want to get back to those markets in a little bit, but for in terms of regions, which global lanes are showing the most potential for growth right now?
The north-south trades are very significant. What I mean by north-south is South America to the northern hemisphere, South America to the European regions is very, very significant. Seafood is also in that particular lane, but also in other lanes, east-west. We have certainly still a very, very robust and vibrant market from the Pacific Northwest into Asia, Southeast Asia into Europe, and also North America is a significant trade lane. So What we're seeing happen is we're seeing a growth and expansion rate take place that's been unprecedented in terms of new sourcing for new products. So I think that's the other piece of information that is pretty relevant.
All right. Now, speaking of those products, traditionally, food and pharmaceuticals dominate cold chain logistics. Are there any other commodities that are gaining significant traction with that particular solution?
One area that's been significant in terms of refrigerated, or maybe I should say insulated product transport, is tied to the EV market, the electric vehicle market, which is related to lithium batteries. And it's not necessarily the lithium batteries that are getting transported, but it's the materials, whether it's the chemicals, the materials that make up the batteries. So some of the chemicals that make up the end products for some of these batteries are being moved in refrigerated containers and even being stored. So that's one example. But we still have, a lot of the medical supplies that need refrigeration or need to be temperature controlled. They're also certainly another big sector that would be considered non-food grade products that are moving in refrigerated containers.
All right. Now, whether it's EV materials or food or pharmaceuticals, what monitoring solutions does the cold chain have that will offer that end-to-end visibility into product movement and temperature control? How does all of that work?
Sure. IoT devices, certainly in terms of the adoption rate, has increased significantly over the past 5 years. And that really relates to container telematic devices that basically are used for monitoring the cargo condition, environment, airflow, temperature. And more importantly, there's electronic monitoring that takes place for early warning diagnostics to prevent failure. So before a failure happens, there's a lot being done on that particular area that really has benefited not only cargo shippers, but also from a claims perspective and things like that. I think that will continue to go ahead and advance. We have some very good technology that's been incorporated into open data sourcing, but also the interoperability of data systems, platforms, and accessing data has been certainly advancing at a rapid pace. So I think that's going to continue.
Sounds like there's a lot of solutions there to kind of monitor the data that shippers need to keep track of their products. Are those solutions being underutilized, do you think, or are they being used to their full potential right now?
I think if you look at the current fleet in the global network, and that's roughly about maybe 4 million T's of a refrigerated container assets that are in the global network. I would say that we have maybe adopted a 25% ratio of actually including electronic monitoring in those refrigerated containers. So we have a lot of upside. Mostly, this will be happening at the new production level where new containers are being produced. The technology will be included in that production cycle. That'll be the easiest way to go ahead and adopt the new technology. But there are retrofits being done. So I think the adoption rate will certainly increase. But there's more cooperation and there's more, as I mentioned before, interoperability of data, open source type solutions that will allow for data sharing and also data pass-through transfers. And one other thing, and I won't get too far into this, but I think AI will also play a very large role in how we leverage the technology related to these new applications.
Actually, we do have to touch on AI a little bit because AI. There's a lot of interest in AI across all kinds of sectors. Are there any real world applications that make an impact for the cold chain?
Well, since we are a leasing company, I am sure I can't speak in detail about the AI applications that are being adopted, but I am sure that the implementation rate for AI for refrigerated container transport is going to go ahead and really accelerate. And I say that only because there's so much friction still in the process of booking, monitoring, and also logging some of that data into our systems. There's been a lot of data rehandling, if I can use that term, And I think that'll go away once we get AI technology implemented and embedded into some of these applications.
All right, speaking of that interoperability, can that data monitoring be merged into other data solutions, dashboards, and then all of that be shareable among all the stakeholders?
Absolutely. And the biggest area right now that's been, I think, a priority for most shippers, carriers, and also leasing companies for that matter, is looking at the CO2 ESG applications for technology, which is really going to be a big part of most of the ocean carriers are looking at trying to get to a net zero target by 2050. Part of that will be refrigerated operations and how they can reduce that CO2 emission footprint. And to do that, they're going to need technology. There's also some regulatory framework that's going to be tied into that particular area, which will go ahead and mitigate tax liability, translate into possible carbon credits. So all of that technology will offer a tremendous benefit in metrics, dashboards, audits, and also compliance in terms of how we take that technology and use it to make sure that those goals and objectives are being met.
All right. Well, speaking of compliance, then, how is the regulatory landscape looking now for temperature-controlled logistics? And what are some of the biggest compliance challenges that you guys face currently?
I would say that, a few years back, there's a heightened awareness, and for the right reasons, on some of the FDA Modernization Act is being certainly, or continues to be amended. But that particular area is really, really important, especially for imported foods, for the safety of the people consuming the foods, and also just to make sure that there's a compliance regulatory framework around imported foods. So the FDA plays a big part on the food safety perspective of how we really look at where we import from, the quality of that particular food source, and also making sure that that continues to be enhanced to make sure that we're protecting the consumer markets in that regard. Tied again back into refrigeration, there's also a lot of focus being looked at relative to refrigerants, refrigerant leakage, which also ties into ESG, CO2 emissions. So all of this, combined into kind of a general regulatory framework, will really be highly dependent on technology. I think it'll also be dependent on AI. I think that will continue to be a real big priority and focus as we continue to see enhancements in the technology space.
All right. It looks like there's a lot of information to follow. If our audience wants to get a hold of that information and find out more about Seacube, where can I send them?
Sure. You can go ahead and send them to www.seacubecontainers.com. Or if there's any questions that would be certainly relevant to this conversation or podcast, you can certainly send me an email. That's gtuthill@seacubecontainers.com.
All right, perfect. We'll have that link and the email in the show notes, so you can one-click directly there. Greg Tuthill, thank you so much for your time today. Best of luck to you and to Seacube, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate it, and thank you for having me on.
Inbound Logistics Magazine is the information leader in supply chain and logistics management. Start your free print and digital subscription today by visiting bit.ly/getil. That's bit.ly/get_IL and stay ahead of the 3PL game.
The Inbound Logistics Podcast is a production of Inbound Logistics Magazine. For the most in-depth information around logistics, transportation, and supply chain practices, get your free print and digital subscription at inboundlogistics.com/subscribe. Connect with us via LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube for the most current developments in the industry. If you'd like to leave us some feedback or have a topic you'd like to see covered in a future episode, call our dialogue line at 888-878-3247 or leave us an email at podcast@inboundlogistics.com. I'm your host, Jeff Vita. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time here on the Inbound Logistics Podcast.